And thanks for joining us for the shorts program that we're actually having a Q&A of. And joining us is 4 of the 5 directors of the films that you just saw. And starting with Suzannah, please introduce yourself, the film you were shared with us today, and where you're calling from.
Hi, I'm Suzannah Mirghani. I'm a filmmaker from Sudan. I am the writer, director, and producer of El Sit. And I am calling from Doha in Qatar, which is miles and miles and miles away from you. And that's why I can't come to the festival.
Thanks for joining us. Ashley.
Hi, my name's Ashley Brim. I'm the writer, director of The Goldfish, and I'm calling from Los Angeles.
And Suzanne and Tom.
Hi, I'm Suzanne, Lenz. I am the co-director, co-writer, co-producer of our film Christmas Eve. This is...
I'm Tom. I'm the co-everything else, and we're calling from Brooklyn, New York. And thanks so much for having us today, Susan.
Yeah.
And then Casey.
Hi, I'm Casey. I am the director and writer, along with my daughter, actually, on the movie Too Many Buddhas. And I'm right now in Los Angeles and very happy to join you.
It's great to have you all here, and it's a wonderful collection of films that I thought really fit together really well. Susanna, starting with you, what inspired you to create this film that you wrote and directed and everything?
Yeah, this is a story from Sudan. We don't have much of a film industry in Sudan. So I always dreamed of making this film, but never thought it was possible. These are childhood memories of mine. You know, this the central character is a 15-year-old girl, and these are my imaginings as a 15-year-old girl as well. Just a collection of stories from my childhood.
Right. And there's an enormous, first of all, it's beautifully shot, and there's a real sense of kind of lyricism, even though it has flights of fancy, but it's very grounded in real truths. Was that inspired by, you know, your own cultural associations with growing up?
Absolutely, yes. Child imagination, folklore, fairy tales, all of these things kind of wrapped up into reality as well. Magical realism is my favorite. I don't know if you call it genre, but it's my favorite kind of lens to look at the world, because I think we all will admit to the fact that the first time that we learned about reality was through fairy tales, right? This is what you get told before you go to bed, you know, and this is how you frame reality in the fairy tale.
Great. Ashley, let's go to you. What inspired you to tell the story you did in The Goldfish?
This one was a little bit different for me. I sat down knowing that I had a deadline and I needed to write something, and it just sort of spilled out. I'm adopted, and I am at the age where I go to a lot of baby showers. And so I think some of that was in there. And also I don't have children. So some of that horror of when you are like, not horror, but, you know, like the comedic elements of going to a place where everybody does and you do not, and children are a little bit foreign to you. I always think it's funny, and I really, and so it's sort of, that's what popped in. That's what popped on the page.
And the lead character, of course, is going through her own trajectory of self-identity in a way that I think probably even blindsides her in a way. Was that something that you could relate to, or it was something that more you observed from other people who you knew maybe had gone through something like that?
I think it really was something I could, I mean, I sort of blindsided myself by even writing about adoption, and now it seems to be all I write about. But that sort of feeling, I think, I mean, it took a really long time for me to realize, you know, it was like really in my 30s when all my friends were having babies, that like I realized like I'd never seen anybody who was related to me. Like, because everybody, all of a sudden what was jumping out to me was like how related everybody looked to each other.
That's a good point. Suzanne and Tom, what inspired you to share Christmas Eve?
It's definitely a story that comes from my own personal background. I have a family that always would gather on Christmas Eves for a big old party. And it was always a raucous time. And unfortunately, I have a lot of men in the family that I grew up in who have taken their own lives. And that's something that's always kind of haunted me my whole life. And it's something too that we're not really supposed to talk about in the family. And so it always kind of felt like this secret that I had been carrying around. And I was encouraged by Tom to just write about it. And I always felt like it could be an interesting story kind of set in the holiday genre film, which can go from being very silly. You know, you have your Christmas Vacations and then you have your It's a Wonderful Life. And I love them all. And I kind of thought, well, what if I put my own story into that kind of genre? And, I was always just interested in how that kind of trauma can get passed down from generation to generation. And no, my dad does not know that I made this film about him, but my mom does know. And she thinks it's great.
Well, the film is an obvious study in contrast between the relationship she has with her mother and with her father. And they are diametrically opposed in a way that also highlights the differences even more accentuated, I think, during the holidays.
It is. Yeah. Holidays are always such a loaded time because we're all expected to be, happy and, we'll have vacations from our work and we're surrounded by our family that maybe we don't see as often. And so, yeah, the holidays have always felt very loaded to me. Like they could be super, super fun, but those parties from my past as a kid, they were always raucous and just like something extraordinary would always happen at these parties. Fun and maybe not so fun things.
Before we get to KC, Lynn, welcome. Please introduce yourself and the film and where you're calling from.
I'm Lynn Sax, and I'm calling from Brooklyn, New York. And you all are screening my film, Maya 24?
Correct.
And that's a film that I will say, actually started when my daughter was 6 years old, and she just recently turned 24. And so I shot a series of films in which she's circling around me. So you have this sensation of her being in this intense, let's say, visual dialogue with someone, the cinematographer, who happens to be her mother. So the film is also called Maya 24 because it runs at 24 frames per second, as film does.
And what format did you shoot it on?
16 millimeter.
Right. It's a beautiful representation of how film can be a time capsule, because we're seeing, I think she was at 6 and 24, and there's an age in between as well.
16.
Actually,
it's like multiple layered exactly on time, because it's time based in its present state as we experience it, but then it as that only this medium can do it can embrace decades.
Tell us a little bit about your sound design, because it's an experimental film, and it has a sense of wistfulness, nostalgia, and maybe even a little melancholy, but I think the sound texture adds a lot to that.
Oh, thank you. So there's a really wonderful fellow named Kevin, and Kevin T. Allen, he always uses the middle initial. And Kevin is a filmmaker, but also someone who's very, very involved in sound editing. And he actually works at Rutgers. And lots of people I know in New York City who are involved in experimental film go down on his off hours and mix their films with Kevin. So I had mixed one other film, a feature-length film called Film About a Father Who, with him the year before, so I knew what a treat it was. And so I would send, in this film, I would just send little like recordings that Maya and I made. He taught me to do something super interesting, which is not to care so much about the intention that comes through sound when you record dialogue, but all that other sound where people are kind of not paying attention, they're like in a space, and you have the rhythms of interactions rather than the delivery of information or communication. So he took that and all of the sound in it, even the sound that feels musical, is actually from voice conversations between the two, me and my daughter.
Wow. Casey, tell us a little bit about where Too Many Buddhas came from.
So first of all, I'm really excited to talk about it actually after hearing Lynn talk about her film, and her beautiful film, because I think that this piece came from a place where I decided, and my daughter decided, who is a teenager right now, that we would work together on something. And Maeve, my daughter, has been sort of having her own very life on her own, apart from me, doing her own stuff. She's an actress and a writer in her own right. And we decided we wanted to do something together and thought about it. And this particular story is based on some truth in my life. I grew up with therapist parents. There was this sort of incident at a certain point in my life where I decided to make appointments with one of my parents because it was the only way I could sort of figure out how to get their attention. And so there was this sort of interesting thing of, hey, we're going to blur the professional parental lines, me and my daughter. So we'll tell a story about blurring the professional parental lines. So that's sort of where it came from. And then it felt, the more we got into it, like really sort of relevant, interesting material. Suddenly we're at this time where, during the pandemic, a lot of these professional parental lines started to blur for people in all sorts of walks of life. And then it was also just very much about, this wanting to tell a story about the difficulty that we all have trying to be seen, even by the people that we love the most. And also seeing the people who we love the most. So that's where it came from.
And the film is wonderful because the relationship is muted until the end. So you don't concentrate on the mother-daughter, but you revisit the entire film in a new way once you discover the kind of casual intimacy they have that still has these weird rules that they seem to abide by.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was the idea. And we wanted to make sure that was blurred or that was disguised until the end. And that ending became, sort of a revelation that did make you rethink, who these people were to each other.
Well, Casey and Lynn, we learned how you cast your films. Suzannah, Ashley, and Suzanne and Tom, why don't you talk about what it took to cast your films, because the acting is wonderful across the board. Suzannah.
As I mentioned earlier, we don't have a film industry in Sudan, so it was very difficult to cast actors because they have no experience. All the young actors have no experience with acting, with film, with cinema, with anything at all. So we held auditions, and it was through auditions that we got all the younger actors in the film. We had Murtada, who plays the main character, Nafisa. For her role, we only got about 5 young girls to audition because acting is not a thing in Sudan. So it's not something to even attract young girls, but it's also something probably their parents didn't want them to do either. But for the young men, oh, we got hundreds, because this is their time, young men in Sudan, this is their time. For the older actors, the grandmother character and all the parents, they're all stage actors. So we do have theater and we do have stage actors, but just bringing all these elements together, stage acting and amateurs together was actually, for me, surprisingly easy to do and easy to work with, because I think they embodied the characters. So this is their life, the grandmother, this is her life. And the young girl, this is, it's not beyond the possibilities to imagine how to act in these roles. So I think they just gave us their real selves.
Right. Ashley.
I just thought the actors in your film were amazing. So congratulations, especially the young actors. I mean, she has so much charisma, you couldn't take your eyes off of her. She's really soulful. Let's see. Mine was a mix. I met Diara, who plays Audrey, through another director friend of mine who also helped produce on the film. She sort of told me from the beginning, like, oh, I know somebody who's like, would be awesome. And I was like, great. And so I met Diara and we clicked right away. And so it was like really exciting to have her. And then she brought Cedric, who played Jason, along with her. They're like old friends from I think their theater days. And then a couple of the other actors were friends of mine. And then Judy Henderson, who's in New York, but is sort of my fairy godmother of all casting. I met her working on Homeland. She put out the call for everybody else. And so we worked together on all the rest of the roles. And then the kids I did here in LA in person.
Right. Tom and Suzanne?
Well, our lead was Suzanne, so that was a pretty easy part to cast. She was writing about herself. She is an actress, and so she wanted to play the part as well. And then the rest of our piece is very small. There's only a character who plays her father, a character who plays her mother, and a character who plays her mother's boyfriend. And so we just knew them from the community of stage and screen here in New York, one of whom had been in a play reading that I did. One had been, how did you meet David? He was...
I had met David, who ends up playing my father at a SAG-AFTRA event where he was leading a seminar on auditioning well. And he was so charismatic while he was talking, and he has a just giant resume. And I had learned too in that seminar that he was actually originally from Kentucky. And I was just about to do this film, and I thought, oh, wow, that's kismet. That's meant to be. So, and it was actually.
Are you from Kentucky?
I am. Yeah, I'm originally from Kentucky, and
that's where the film is set.
And that's where the film is set. And yeah, so we just thought it was so cool that David was actually from there as well. He got the accent immediately.
I'm originally from Tennessee.
Oh yeah.
Oh right nice. On. And then Janet is a friend of a friend who so it was great to have her, and she's like just a super talented actress, and was luckily available.
And an educator as well. I think she's one of the heads of the grad acting program at NYU. Yeah. So she was great to work with as kind of early directors, first-time directors, because we had just this very professional cast that could really help us, hone the approach.
Susanna talked about a very happy accident in coordinating the film. Sometimes there are happy accidents, or sometimes there are accidents that you learn from that you weren't expecting when you take on a project. So, Casey, can you think of an example where something didn't quite go the way you expected it, but you either learned from it or you capitalized on it?
Something did not go as we expected. Let me think. Well, I mean, there are two things. I'm not sure this is exactly what you're asking. One is we were stuck in Los Angeles due to the pandemic. And I always felt, I'm from New York City, I always felt this was a very New York story. even though it just takes place in one room. My characters were New York, the feel was, and I really, really wanted New York. So we did have sort of an interesting situation of having to create what I felt was enough of a New York feel in the middle of Valencia, California. And that was interesting. Now, in terms of any accidents, my daughter Maeve, who plays the role of Nora, had never played the flute. Shockingly, does a beautiful job of sounding like someone who can't play the flute. But she really, she struggled through that, and it was fun to use her struggles in the reality of the actual film.
That's a perfect example. Ashley, what's something that maybe didn't go quite the way you expected it to, but you either learned from it or used it?
I think the thing that, like, the biggest thing, I mean, we knew that we would only have the kids. I guess when I wrote it, I didn't know, but like we would only have the kids for one day because of limited set hours and everything else. And so I think the thing that I really learned was how much you can do with your sound designer to really like create a world that you didn't quite have. And so, you know, we shot the kids. That was like our really big day. And then the rest of the film, we're trying, you know, we had to block everything so that like there's no evidence. You're never looking in the direction where the kids were supposed to be. But I felt really lucky that Colette, my sound designer, and she was really able to and also our production sound mixer was really smart and grabbed a lot of wild sounds, even in between takes, like just over the course of that day, that we were able to build in and create that aliveness of consistency throughout. So I hadn't run into that before. And so it was really nice to kind of get to use other tools.
Lynn, when did you decide to make the film as a film? I mean, you'd been shooting these pieces years apart from each other. When did the concept of a film materialize in your mind?
Well, actually, I first heard a term in a film by Robert Frank, the photographer. And he used the term photograph of wind. And I just loved that conceptually, the notion that we try to grasp something that cannot be through our eyes, but we can only understand it by how it affects other things, which is to me kind of a conceit for how, let's say, how narrative works. We really understand a person by how they impact another person and who they are in the company of that swirl. And so I thought, I want to make a film that can try to articulate that trope, the photograph of the wind. So coincidentally, my daughter Maya's name actually means illusion, and that's part of the whole practice of filmmaking. We don't really see motion. We just blur these frames together. So photograph of motion is what film is. So I was playing with all of those things and with her name. And that was when she was 6 years old. And then I wanted to return to that footage one more time. And I was thinking about the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who used the term same stream twice. And again, I thought about the camera and film, that we actually can return to the same stream twice, but it's only a simulation of that. So I returned to her childhood at a later age, but also at a younger age. So again, that was another iteration, same stream twice. And then the third was Maya at 24, but all of them have a kind of self-reflexive quality, or an attempt to kind of meditate on what it is to film something you can't really hold, which is childhood or the presence of another person.
Right. Tom and Suzanne, what's another example of something that maybe didn't go quite the way you expected, but which turned out either a lesson or an epiphany?
Well, a big part of the story are the kind of echoes of trauma, and this is coming off of what you just said, Lynn. That was very, very well said, by the way. But just like the kind of way, the way that time permeates the narrative of our story, but also the way time permeates film. And so when we were going to try to discover the way that we would embody the past and these echoes of the past, we went into our own family trove of like old 8mm films and footage of Suzanne, VHS footage of Suzanne when she was young. And so we end up kind of like bringing the actual people that kind of inspired the film into the film, some of them in this spectral way, some of whom have been dead for a very long time. And so we opened the film with like, old 8mm footage of my family. And then, we intercut footage of Suzanne contemporaneously with her as a little girl as well. And so I think that was something that we didn't expect to do necessarily when we set out to make the film. And it was something that kind of evolved as we went through our editorial process. And I'm really glad it did, because I think it adds a really, just a layer of depth to the filmmaking that I think is really interesting.
And a wonderful texture as well, just visual texture, and then just a way to establish a character very quickly. So, Susanna, before we go, a couple of things. Just first of all, the idea of agency is so important in all these films, whether the elusive attempt for it or being able to find some sense of it or coming to terms with it. But I think your film subverts our expectations just because she finds agency in a quite remarkable way that is not what the older generation is and not what her parents is, something completely different that's she owns herself. Talk a little bit about developing that idea.
Well, I mean, we always have this struggle between the traditional and the modern, and usually it's whether one is better or the other, and you have a divisive conversation, whereas there's a little bit of good in both and there's a little bit of bad in both. And this is really what she stands in the middle of both of these. And she says, I don't want your restrictive traditions, and I don't want your neoliberal creeping in neoliberalism creeping into the village either. I just want to live here and live well. And she's only 15, so she can't make all these decisions for herself, but she shows you what she wants.
It's perfectly communicated. So thank you. To all our filmmakers, just to wrap up, what's next for you, Suzannah?
El Cid is actually a proof of concept. So I made it because I knew nobody would ever give me money for my first feature. So now I'm hoping that you like what you see and you give me money for my first feature.
Good luck with that. That's great. Ashley.
The Goldfish is actually also a proof of concept, but I hadn't written the feature and then the story got too big. So now it's a proof of concept for a pilot that I'm writing.
Right. Lynn, we see stuff from you all the time. It's always really exciting, but what's next?
Well, actually, I never make short films for that reason. I'm so happy both of you want to make features, but I like the short film and I like the long film. I like all the ranges, and I think our culture is actually finally celebrating the short film, seeing it as a gem, seeing it as parallel to a poem, and that not everybody wants to write a novel. We can write a series of a suite of poems, and they have their impact, and maybe the time has come to accept that. And Sterling, you are a real advocate for that. So this film and 7 others are going to be on the Criterion channel beginning next month. So they'll be visible that way. And I'm pretty excited about that. And I'm working to support them.
Awesome. Suzanne and Tom.
We would like to turn Christmas Eve into a feature. And we have another short called Two Women on the Bridge, which we shot during the pandemic in July of last year. In 2020. And so hopefully that will come out soon. And I also shot a feature, which I didn't write or direct, but I was producer on and was in, called Every Man for Himself, which will hopefully come to a film festival sometime soon.
Great. And Casey?
So Too Many Buddhas, yes, we had always sort of had the intention of delving deeper into these characters and making the world bigger. So we are doing that in our own way, my daughter Maeve and I, and then myself, I'm working on another project called A Cow in the Sky, which is based on a true story. And that sort of is in its final stages of production. And then also I'm working on a personal piece called Return to the Bomb, where I am returning to my old days of comedy.
Well, thank you to everyone. They're all wonderful shorts. Thank you to the patrons, to the MVFF audience. Please join us for all the other shorts programs. They're all really worth your time and effort. Thanks you for supporting shorts. Thanks for supporting the California Film Institute, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you, Sterling.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.